The Army said blacks didn't have the mental capacity or the moral fortitude to be pilots. They said, we've studied the issue. We know it won't be successful. We'll experiment. You keep pushing us, we'll authorize a squadron.
And up we go. And gear up, we're going. Okay, we're no longer on autopilot, and you're doing the flying. Wow. We'll do the VFR all the way to Dover if you'll let us.
Absolutely, just DD1. In fact, I'll give you a Bravo clearance if you'd like it. Contact approach 124.55, and happy birthday again.
We're 20 feet, 10, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, let's let it roll. Nicely done.
Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, a weekly show with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Trescott. You just heard audio from a video produced by students of Endicott College, which we'll talk more about during the news. And for our main topic today, we'll be talking about Special VFR, and not just about the regulations, but more importantly about when you should and shouldn't use Special VFR. And if you notice I sound just a little different today, it's because I'm recording this at the Monterey Jet Center in Monterey, California. And I'll tell you why in our update section. And if you happen to be thinking about someday buying a Cirrus, maybe an SR20 or SF50 Vision Jet, please call me today at 650-967-2500 for a free consultation and possibly a free demo flight. Last week in episode 136, we talked about my 75 hours of flying a Cirrus Vision Jet in about a 5-week period, so if you missed that, you may want to check it out. And just a quick note, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button on your phone. Won't cost you anything, but it will alert you when new shows are available each week, and it will also boost our rankings, making it more likely that other people will find the show. This week in the news, 2 groups have decided to stop flying their B-17s. EAA issues a caution regarding an aircraft registration renewal scam, and another big GA aircraft company may be sold. All this and more, and the news starts now. From warbirdsnews.com, the National Warplane Museum in Geneseo, New York, has just announced that they will no longer be flying the late David Talichet's Boeing B-17G Flying Fortress. Instead, they're going to be returning the aircraft to the Warbird Collector's estate. Known as the Memphis Belle because of the markings the aircraft gained during the making of the 1988 war film, Memphis Belle, this B-17 has long been associated with Geneseo, regularly appearing at their air shows from the late 1980s onward and finding a semi-permanent home there in 2016. The museum released the following statement regarding their decision. They said, in light of the increasing hourly operating and insurance costs in connection with the aircraft, the museum's board of trustees has decided to cease operating the airplane effective immediately and terminate the lease of the aircraft. They say, we have notified the Talichet family, and we are working through the process of returning the aircraft. It's important to note that the B-17 is not being grounded, just that the museum has decided that they can no longer justify the resources necessary to both lease and operate the aircraft. Presumably, the aircraft will find another home where she will continue flying, but this is not a given in today's environment. This unfortunate news follows a similarly disappointing announcement from the Lone Star Flight Museum in Houston, Texas last week. They have also decided to stop flying their B-17G, at least for the rest of 2020. In their statement on Facebook last week, they too noted rising costs as a major factor in their decision. Quote, due to the rising operational expenses, following this Saturday's flight, there are no further plans to fly the B-17 for the remainder of 2020. From EAA.org, EAA is warning its members to regard any solicitation they may receive regarding aircraft registration renewal, especially those that call for using a search engine to find the registration site, with a healthy dose of suspicion. EAA is aware of several businesses, and you can hear aircraft taking off here at Monterey. EAA is aware of several businesses with names, web URLs, and logos that may appear reminiscent of a government agency that notify aircraft owners of impending registration expiration, mine from publicly available registration information, and direct them to use search engines such as Google to find the proper renewal site. These businesses then buy ads from search engines to make their site appear first before the FAA website in the search results. Such operations add little or no actual value to the transaction and charge a hefty fee for essentially duplicating the same process the FAA directly administers for a mere $5. EAA members should ensure they are on the FAA's online registration portal before filling out information and entering payment. Unless a business is known to be reputable and offers a tangible service above and beyond a simple registration renewal, such as expedited processing or automatic renewal, EAA members should deal directly with the FAA. If any member wants EAA's help with registration renewal or any other issue, they say you can contact them at 800-546-6322. From AOPA.org, this comes from an article they called IFR Fix the Extra Airspeed Exception. You've added several knots to your aircraft's Category B approach speed for the rime icing on your wings. Now you add a few more for wind shear on final. That leaves you flying a Category B certified aircraft at a Category C airspeed on an approach without published Category C minimums. Can you continue? Until the FAA announced an update to the Aeronautical Information Manual, which took effect January 30th, the answer was no. After that date, the answer is yes, but. All instrument pilots learn about aircraft approach speed categories A through E that determine the ceiling and visibility minimums to apply when flying approaches. Most GA pilots fly aircraft certified in Category A, which is 0 to 90 knots, or Category B, 91 to 120 knots. The speeds are based on the aircraft's published VREF, or 1.3 VSO at the maximum certified landing weight, which never changes. But operating conditions do change. Instrument pilots also learn that when an aircraft certified in one approach speed category must use an out-of-category speed, perhaps to compensate for icing or gusty winds, the higher categories minimums apply. If higher category minimums were not authorized, neither was your approach. Under the new AIM guidance, it's permissible to fly the approach at an airspeed higher than the range of your aircraft's category and still use the aircraft's certified speed category minimums. That is, a Category B aircraft can fly an approach at Category C speed and use Category B minimums. But doing this raises special risks, notes Rune Duke, AOPA Senior Director of Airspace, Air Traffic, and Aviation Security. For one thing, approach procedure designs are based on the highest speed for a category. Maneuvering at a higher airspeed could put you outside a circling approach protected area, the FAA noted in a presentation. And there's a job of landing from a faster than normal approach. Runway length, obstacle, and landing distance calculations must be considered, the FAA added. The extra leeway pilots are granted to cope with these different scenarios following the revision of AIM Paragraph 5-4-7 comes with several other caveats. The FAA continues to encourage pilots to, quote, apply higher minimums as a proven best practice. And it reminds pilots that another strategy to consider as an alternative to operating at higher speed in non-normal conditions is to land on a different runway or at a different airport. And also from AOPA.org, the Air Force is providing $1 million for Plain English Pilot Skills app. The U.S. Air Force is providing $1 million to 3 Purdue University aviation and science graduates for Plain English, that's all one word, an app to help develop and mature a suite of critical communication skills that advance pilot safety. The Small Business Innovation Research Phase 2 Award is sponsored by the U.S. Air Force, the service's agile technology and innovation hub that acts as a catalyst for new ideas that lead to advanced problem-solving techniques and ultimately more efficiency. Plain English is an app-based aviation radio simulator to help new pilots acquire radio communication proficiency by developing advanced skills in more realistic environments, the university wrote in a news release. Aeronautics and astronautics graduate Muharrem Main, aviation and transportation technology graduate Aaron Hadamuloglu, and computer science graduate Sam Dixon pool the resources and talents to launch the app, which guides users through simple and complicated interactions with ATC on every phase of flight, including taxi, takeoff, airspace entrance, and approaches. Main says he got the idea for the app after one of his first flights with an instructor. He remembered being told what to say to ATC, and he had practiced it aloud before he pressed the mic button. However, by the time he keyed the mic, I know this happens to all of us, he had forgotten much of the information. He told the university during a 2018 interview that he was either too slow or I messed something up, and there was another airplane close by, and the instructor didn't have time for me to get my sentence right and clutter the airwaves. To keep the lessons on track, the instructor took over communication duties, but the experience left a mark with Maine. The app was designed with more than 50 guided lessons from the simple to the complex. Users must respond properly with the correct phraseology and speech rate, along with other factors. If you only practice a handful of times, you just don't get good at it, Maine said. The technology was rolled out first for the military and has proven so effective that it is trickling down to civilian GA use. Maine called the funding a tremendous opportunity for us to play an even bigger part in helping the Air Force train pilots using a digital approach that's proven popular with users. Maine also said the technology comes at a time when the FAA has increased focus on English language proficiency for pilots and started asking instructors to test their students on their speaking and communication abilities. From Forbes.com, here's what a Bombardier Textron deal would mean for the business jet industry. And there's been some speculation in the industry that Bombardier might sell part of their business to Textron, and this article talks a little bit about the impact that might have. It says, troubled Bombardier has reportedly been in talks to sell its business jet division to Textron, according to the Wall Street Journal. Were this to come to fruition, it would have several implications for the business jet industry. The business jet market is overcrowded, as I've written previously. 5 primary manufacturers produce 40 different models, vying for just 700 worldwide sales a year. A Textron purchase of Bombardier would help alleviate the overcapacity somewhat. Bombardier's small jet division, Learjet, would squarely overlap with the Citation jets made by Textron's Cessna unit. Learjet sales have slowed significantly, and the Lear 70 and Lear 75 models face a very uncertain future, whether under Textron or Bombardier. Moving up the Bombardier jet model food chain brings us to the midsize Challenger line. The long-successful Challenger 350, or CL350, sits almost exactly on top of Cessna's brand-new Citation Longitude. While the CL350 has a nice following and has earned respect, it's been 6 years since it debuted, and it's arguably in need of a makeover. The same goes for the next larger Challenger 650, which also had its last upgrade at around the same time as the CL350. However, the CL650 differs in that it is a much older design and has undergone so many upgrades over time with engines, avionics, and other improvements that there's really nowhere left to go. It's likely that Cessna has a product path for its new Longitude called its Longitude Plus and could conceivably position itself squarely between the CL350 and CL650, essentially eliminating both models. That leaves the most lucrative and largest Bombardier jets, the Global line, ripe for Textron to plug into its current lineup of small and medium jets, giving it the long-missing large products to effectively compete with the likes of General Dynamics, Gulfstream, and Falcon units. Thus, should the deal close, a maximum of just 4 models would come off the market, leaving 36, which wouldn't go far towards solving the industry's oversupply problem. Textron is the only business jet maker that makes sense as a new owner. Embraer is busy with Boeing, while Gulfstream and Falcon have competing large cabin products to Bombardier's. However, there are other potential bidders. There's also a good chance that a Textron deal will never come to fruition. Textron's financial performance has been stressed lately, and the outlook going forward isn't looking much better. It would thus seem a stretch for Textron to pay what would likely be in the billions of dollars for Bombardier business jets. From AIN Online, Embraer's best-selling jet gets even more phenomenal. Embraer executive jets today announced an upgraded Phenom 300 that can fly faster and farther, offers a quieter cabin, and has more capable avionics. Deliveries of the enhanced Phenom 300E are expected to begin in May, the company said. This builds on enhancements Embraer announced for the light jet about 2 years ago. The upgraded twin jet, with a baseline list price of $9.65 million, now boasts a top speed of Mach 0.8 versus Mach 0.78 on previous Phenom 300 and 300Es, thanks to a pair of new FADEC-equipped Pratt & Whitney PW535E1 turbofans that each produce 3,478 pounds of thrust. Range also rises to 2,010 miles, up from 1,971 miles. Inside the aircraft will incorporate noise reduction improvements that result in a quieter cabin and better flight crew seat tracking that provides more legroom. Its upgraded Prodigy Touch flight deck, which is based on the Garmin 3000 avionics, also adds capabilities such as runway overrun awareness and alerting system, predictive wind shear, emergency descent mode, performance and takeoff landing data, and FAA datacom. The new Phenom 300E also has an available option for 4G connectivity via a GoGo Advanced L5 system. And wouldn't we all like to have 4G in all the aircraft that we fly? In international news, we have 2 stories from AustralianFlying.com.au. First is Wings Over Illawarra 2020, that's WOI, will feature a dedicated GA precinct, and I think by that I mean a special area at the exhibit. The announcement marks the return to WOI of a heavy GA involvement last seen at the event in 2017. In 2020, Wings Over Illawarra will incorporate a GA precinct featuring static aircraft displays and flying schools, along with industry exhibitor sites for aviation suppliers, manufacturers, and service providers. The introduction of the GA precinct will provide the aviation community with a general and recreational aviation industry event alongside Australia's premier annual air show, while showcasing grassroots aviation to one of the largest air show crowds in Australia. Aircraft displays will range from microlights and gyrocopters to the latest in composite sport and recreational aircraft, plus, of course, the classics and a few of the more unusual aircraft types. In order to encourage GA participation, exhibitor sites within the GA precinct are being offered free of charge. Underwing camping will be permitted for the first time, and the temporary restricted area will be lifted at 4 p.m. to reduce last light issues for pilots wanting to fly home after the display before it gets dark. WOI has concentrated largely on military warbirds and aerobatics over the past 3 years. And also from Down Under, Diamond Crash casts doubt on incipient spin training. This is a slightly older article, but I came across it and thought it was relevant. The fatal crash of a Diamond DA-40 in Queensland has cast doubt over whether or not some aircraft are suitable for incipient spin training. It says that on a simulated test flight out of Archer Field in September 2017, the aircraft crashed, killing both the student and the instructor. According to the Australian Transport Safety Bureau, or ATSB, in their report that was released, the aircraft impacted the ground after it failed to recover from a developed spin, most likely the result of advanced stall training. Radar data shows the aircraft conducted several short climbs followed by brief, rapid descents. On the final sequence, the aircraft climbed to 4,500 feet, after which it entered a near vertical descent at about 6,000 feet per minute. The instructor was able to broadcast a mayday call saying the aircraft was in a spin before it impacted the ground. On-site examination of the wreckage and surrounding ground marks indicated that the aircraft impacted terrain left wing first, nose down and rotating to the left at low forward speed. This was consistent with a left upright spin. The forward fuselage separated at the engine firewall. The wings, center fuselage, and rear fuselage all separated in a direction consistent with a left spin. The ATSB subsequently found that Diamond Aircraft does not approve the DA-40 for intentional spins, either incipient or fully developed, and that such action was outside the aircraft's approved envelope. The CASA syllabus for RPL training requires a student to demonstrate the ability to recognize and recover from an incipient spin. During the investigation, the ATSB found that many flying training organizations did not consider that an incipient spin was included in the definition of intentional spinning, as found in the Pilot's Operating Handbook of many training aircraft used in Australia. Some organizations may be conducting this training in aircraft not approved for intentional spinning. The ATSB advises these training organizations to clarify with aircraft manufacturers the extent to which the intentional entry into the early stages of a spin, including an incipient spin, is permissible. And from aeronews.net comes sad news that Alexander Sandy Hill has passed away. He founded and managed the Master Instructor Program along with his wife, aviation education legend and safe charter member and proud Marine, G. Alexander Sandy Hill. He passed away at his home after a long illness. Among many contributions to aviation, Sandy and his wife and partner Joanne formed and managed the Master Instructor Program, which celebrates 25 years and over 1,800 total MCFI certifications. Together, they also revitalized the General Aviation Awards Program in the early 2000s and motivated our industry ever greater professionalism and excellence. And apparently there's a YouTube video that's been posted that talks about the contributions of Sandy and Joanne over the years. SAFE Executive Director David St. George said in an email that Sandy will be missed by all his friends at SAFE and throughout our aviation family. We extend our heartfelt sympathy to the family at this time. And I came to know Joanne and Sandy through the Master CFI program, and then later, when I was named the 2008 National CFI of the Year, spent a lot of time with them in Oshkosh. And I must say that Sandy was a wonderful human being, and he's going to be greatly missed. And finally, from GeneralAviationNews.com, a student film celebrates the Tuskegee Airmen. A new film created by students at Endicott College in Beverly, Massachusetts, celebrates the heroism and history of the Tuskegee Airmen, the all-black fighter pilot unit that blazed trails as the first black combat pilots in U.S. history during World War II. The 6-minute documentary, released in time for Black History Month, reveals a new dimension to the pilots whose members were required to fly upwards of 100 missions, far more than the typical 50 of their white counterparts, according to the student filmmakers. The airmen are credited with flying 1,578 combat missions over Germany, Africa, and Italy during World War II. They were also one of the most effective units in the U.S. Army Air Corps. In an interview with 100-year-old Colonel Charles E. McGee, who remains a pilot and is shown flying and landing a private jet during the film, it's revealed that the squadron was not expected to be successful, as the Army said blacks didn't have the mental capacity or moral fortitude to be pilots, according to McGee. The Endicott students who produced the film were Hannah Deigel, Jessica Geising, and Michael Roderati. The team, with their professors, Steve Liss, traveled to Bethesda, Maryland to interview McGee and to conduct research on the Tuskegee Airmen. They did all the planning, filming, editing, and post-production. Quote, working on the Tuskegee Airmen video was an inspirational and eye-opening experience. I was given the chance to meet and speak with a member of American history, as well as edit a mini documentary around his life. This opportunity has opened many doors professionally and artistically, said Rotorati. By the way, at the end of the video, it shows Colonel McGee piloting a Vision Jet, along with my friend Boni Caldera. He's an executive director of sales at Cirrus. And we'll include a link to the video in our show notes. That's the news for this week. Coming up next, my weekly updates, and then we'll get to our main topic, which is Special VFR, all right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now here's some updates. I'm here in Monterey, California today. That's where the AT&T Pebble Beach Pro-Am is being held this weekend. That's a famous golf tournament here in the U.S. And I flew down here this morning with the owner of a Vision Jet and a couple of his friends. They are off to see the golf tournament, and I'm here at the Monterey Jet Center. And the Jet Center was kind enough to offer me a room where I could do some recording. Now, when I'm sitting up at the table, I have a great view out the window toward the runway, and I can look down on a display of 4 Gulfstream jets. As you can imagine, there are a lot of wealthy people who fly in for this event, and Gulfstream is here showcasing their products. Now, here's the funny part of this. I'm actually at the moment sitting on the floor, partially under a table, because the sound quality is a little bit better down here. So anyway, you can just only imagine what this must look like. And I'm holding the microphone with my hand. And the funny thing is, I've just been traveling so much the last couple of weeks that I haven't had much time at home to record. So I figured I've got some downtime here in Monterey, might as well give it a shot. Anyway, I spent some time outside, and I want to thank one of the salespeople from Gulfstream, Kirsten Kruger. She spent a lot of time with me and gave me a great tour inside a full mock-up of the Gulfstream 700, which they'll start to deliver in a few years. I think this is the top of their product line. It has a range of 7,500 nautical miles, so it can literally travel around the world. And I was really impressed when I climbed aboard to see that I could stand up anywhere in the jet without bending over, and I'm over 6 feet tall, so it has a lot of headroom inside. I sat in the cockpit for a while, and I was really impressed by what they call their Symmetry flight deck, which is powered by Honeywell. It has 4 large 14-inch displays and 5 smaller touchscreen controllers that provide input to the system. It also has dual HUDs, heads-up display, one for the pilot and one for the co-pilot. And these provide both the SVS and EVS displays. Now, SVS provides essentially a wire mesh view of the terrain below, and EVS, or the Enhanced Vision System, gives you an infrared view to help you peer just a little bit further through any haze or mist that you might have. And the best feature is that Gulfstream incorporates the Cirrus side stick for controlling the plane. Now, I'm kidding, of course. I don't think Cirrus invented the side stick, but it's interesting to me that the most common question I get about Cirrus aircraft, and we've got another plane taking off here, is how long does it take for a pilot to get used to using a side stick versus a yoke? To which I tell people, about 10 seconds. It's totally a non-issue, and pilots adapt to it immediately. Now, what I really like about side sticks is that it opens up the cockpit so that you get a full view of everything, and none of the avionics are blocked from view, as would be the case with a traditional yoke. So, great choice in the design here to use side sticks. Now, behind the cockpit, back in the cabin, Kirsten showed me the crew rest area and explained that there are standards for certifying crew rest areas in terms of how quiet it is and how dim the light is and so on, so that they really truly do get rest as they're traveling overseas. She then showed me the kitchen, which had a couple of ovens, a refrigerator, a sink. Behind that was a really large cabin with a sofa and many chairs. And behind that was the owner's stateroom with a bed and the optional shower. Now, needless to say, I was very impressed with this aircraft. And it made me think that perhaps we should interview someone from Gulfstream before a future show here. So we'll see what we can do about that. Now let's listen to another fun flying destination. Here's Jackson from Minnesota.
Hi, Max. Jackson from Minnesota for another fun flying destination. Today I want to recommend several airports that are all within a stone's throw of each other. The first is Superior Airport in Wisconsin. Identifier Kilo Sierra Uniform Whiskey. This is one of the few airports in Wisconsin with an on-airport restaurant, and that alone makes it worth the visit in my book, as we should all support airport restaurants. It's called the Upper Deck and has tasty food as well as its own ramp, so you need to pay attention when taxiing. If you want another restaurant nearby, the burger joint called The Shack has delicious burgers, and the FBO has a crew car for transport. The second airport is so close you can almost stay in the traffic pattern. This one is called Sky Harbor Airport in Minnesota. The identifier is Kilo Delta Yankee Tango. This is a seaplane base that also has an asphalt runway. After you've enjoyed lunch in Wisconsin, you can land at Sky Harbor and walk off some of those calories on the beach about 100 yards away. From Sky Harbor, you can get in to Duluth by Uber, but you are on the other side of the main lift bridge into Duluth Harbor, which can cause a 15 to 20-minute wait. This brings me to the last of the 3 airports, Duluth Airport itself. The airport identifier is Kilo Delta Lima Hotel. As I'm sure every listener to this show is aware, here you will find the main headquarters for Cirrus. They only do tours on Wednesdays at 1 p.m. For those of us who are VFR pilots, that can be a challenge because of the proximity to the lake. The other fun reason to visit is the annual air show. It's usually in July. This coming season, it's July 18 and 19 of 2020. Because of the National Guard base on site, the show is surprisingly big and diverse. So there you go, another fun destination in the land north of Toronto.
Thanks very much, Jackson. And if you have a fun flying destination you would like to share, just go ahead and record a voice memo on your smartphone and then email it to me at aviationnewstalk@gmail.com, and we'll play it on a future show. By the way, I was just down on the ramp getting a little bit of lunch, and I saw one of the FAA's flight check jets out there, November 5-6, which is a Learjet 60. And those are used to test the different navigational aids, for example, to check ILSs and VORs and make sure that they're all in compliance. And I'm guessing this one is based out of Sacramento because I know the FAA has a small flight check group that operates out there. And that's something we should probably talk about sometime. So we'll look at that as a future show topic. Also out on the ramp, I ran into a good friend, Laurent, who was former flight instructor in Palo Alto and now working for Embraer. And he brought the Phenom 300E out here for demonstration that's out on the ramp. Now, that's not the new one we just talked about a few moments ago. He said that the one that has all the latest features and the increased engine power will be coming to his group in about a week, and that's when they'll get their first chance to try out all those new features. Also out on the ramp, Embraer is displaying their Predator 500, which is the next step up from the Phenom 300E. Now, I ran across a couple articles this week about accidents. Both of these came out of planeandpilotmag.com, great magazine. And one of them is about a Cirrus SR20 fuselage damaged during crash in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And according to this, the pilot reported that while en route, he applied left rudder to stay coordinated and that he alternated his left and right legs due to muscle fatigue. Now, this sounds very non-standard. If he had to hold rudder in flight, then it sounds to me like the trim tab on the rudder was not properly bent in the correct location. So anytime when you're straight and level and your feet are off the rudders and your normal cruise, if the sled skip indicator is displaced, then the aircraft is not in trim. You probably need to have the tab bent by a mechanic to try and get it into a better place. Anyway, during the landing flare, he used very little rudder to maintain center line, and about 1 to 2 feet above the ground, the airplane suddenly yawed left about 30 to 45 degrees. He added there was not enough right rudder to maintain the airplane parallel with the runway, so he decided to go around. He applied power, and the airplane then yawed violently left and impacted the ground, exited the runway to the left, and came to a rest in the grass left of the parallel taxiway. By the way, he survived, so this was not a fatal accident, though the next one we're going to talk about is examination of the data revealed that within 25 seconds of the accident, the aircraft descended at a rate peaking around 1,019 feet per minute, which would be a little unstable. Generally, planes are landing around 500-600 feet per minute. And the indicated airspeed decreased from 86 knots to 60 knots. Now, I got to tell you, that is way too slow in a Cirrus. About 2 seconds before the accident, the pitch attitude peaked at 7 degrees with a left roll of 16 degrees. And data revealed that the pilot landed with a slight tailwind. It was essentially 360 at 5 knots, and he was landing on runway 19 left. Probable cause, pilot's failure to maintain a stabilized approach with a tailwind and a subsequent failure to maintain yaw control during an attempted go-around. And yes, if you are right at stall speed and you suddenly add a whole lot of power with an aircraft with a big engine, yeah, you can expect that aircraft is going to roll to the left. So he got way too slow, it sounds like. Now, this other article from Plane and Pilot Mag says, after the accident, a single pilot was not enough. And they talked about the crash of a Cessna 500 Citation in 2017 in Marietta, Georgia. Now, they didn't talk much about the details of the crash, so I had to look it up, and here's what it said on aviation-safety.net. It said, the flight was uneventful until ATC amended the flight plan, which required the pilot to manually enter the new routing information into the GPS. A few minutes later, the pilot told the controller that he was having problems with the GPS and asked for a direct route to his destination. During the descent, the pilot told the controller that the airplane had a steering problem and was in the clouds. The pilot was instructed to descend the airplane to 4,100 feet, which was the minimum vectoring altitude. The airplane continued to descend, entered VMC, and then descended below the assigned altitude. The controller queried the pilot about the airplane's low altitude and instructed him to maintain 4,100 feet. The pilot responded that he was unsure if he would be able to climb the airplane back to that altitude due to steering issues. The controller issued a low altitude warning and again advised the pilot to climb back to 4,100 feet. The pilot responded that the autopilot was working again and he was able to climb the plane to the assigned altitude. The controller then instructed the pilot to change to another radio frequency, but the pilot responded that he was still having a problem with the GPS. The pilot asked the controller to give him direct routing to the airport. A few minutes later, the pilot told the controller that he was barely able to keep the airplane straight and its wings level. Shortly before the airplane impacted the ground, a witness saw the airplane make a complete 360-degree roll to the left, enter a steep 90-degree bank to the left, roll inverted, and enter a vertical nosedive crash. Now here's what planeandpilotmag.com had to say about the crash. The Cessna 500 Citation is a sophisticated 8-seat twin-engine jet that under its original FAA certification required a crew of 2, pilot and co-pilot. However, subsequently the FAA approved a single pilot authorization course that allows the jet to be flown by a single pilot if they completed an authorized course each year. When it investigated the March 2017 crash of a Cessna 500 in a residential area of Marietta, Georgia, one of the things the NTSB wanted to determine was whether the pilot, who was the only occupant, was properly qualified to fly the airplane by himself. After all, Citations are flown single pilot all the time without incident. Investigators heard from a friend of the pilot who reported that he had repeatedly told the pilot he needed a co-pilot on board. He reported that the pilot's response was that he preferred to fly alone. The friend also said that the pilot claimed no single pilot exemption was needed for him because the airplane had one as a result of having received a single pilot conformity certificate relating to some modifications that had been made for the previous owner. The friend was interviewed by both the FAA and the NTSB. Investigators contacted several training facilities that provided single pilot training for Citations, but none could find a record of having trained the pilot or granted him single pilot authority. The friend said that the pilot would never trim the airplane before turning on the autopilot. He said that he was constantly fighting the autopilot and complaining that the airplane was uncontrollable. The friend told an anecdote of once having been called to fly to Savannah to repair the airplane after the pilot said it was uncontrollable. After arriving, he flew the airplane and found that it was just not trimmed properly. The pilot, aged 78, had a private certificate rated for single-engine land and seaplane, multi-engine land airplanes and instruments. His logbooks were unavailable for review. His prior medical application showed 6,000 total hours. Now, on the face of this to me sounds like a pilot who perhaps didn't know his avionics as well as he could have. And maybe he once knew them well, but as he got older, maybe he became less skilled at using them. I think the two key takeaways are that if you don't fully understand your avionics and your autopilot, then you should commit yourself to learning them. And as we all get older, we will lose some of our flying skills, and we should plan on scaling back the complexity of the kind of flying we do so that we don't someday find ourselves in over our heads. And here's another interesting article that I read on airfaxjournal.com. I'll include a link to it in the show notes. It says why upset training just doesn't work. Now, a lot of people talk about the merits of upset training, and this gentleman believes that the problem with that is that if someone is flying so poorly that they get themselves into an unusual attitude, they probably will lack the skills and capabilities to remember what they learned in upset training to be able to right the aircraft and to save themselves. He says an upset training course can certainly make any of us more precise pilots and probably more cautious pilots. Enhancing stick and rudder skills is always a good thing, but as a solution to loss of control in flight, the upset training just isn't it. Avoiding the loss of control is what matters in every case, just as avoiding flying into the ground is of paramount importance. And the more we train and maintain practice maintaining safe margins, the safer all of our flying will be, whether we have flown inverted or performed a roll or not. And I think the key point here is maintaining safe margins. I'm constantly talking with my clients about trying to build margin into everything that they do. For example, someone asked me earlier today, gosh, could a Vision Jet land at Palo Alto, which has 2,500 feet of runway? And I said, yeah, absolutely, under certain temperature conditions and certainly loading conditions, and I would never do it because I like to have plenty of margin in all aspects of my flying. And now let me give you an update on the Vision Jet flying I've been doing, probably another 25, 30 hours in the last 10 days since the last show. I did shoot a great photo going into Ogden, Utah, and it was at night. It was virtually dark, but my camera has a night mode and picked up not only the terrain that was being displayed on the MFD, but I could also see the snow-covered mountain outside in front of the window. So it was a rather great illustration of why you want to always have terrain displayed anytime you're in the mountains because, yes, there are some nasty things that lurk out there. Now, I was in and out of Hawthorne several times last week, and while I was there, I got an email from one of our Patreon supporters, Russell Newman, who said he had just seen a Vision Jet out on the ramp and wondered if that meant I was there. And turns out he was all of 100 yards from where I was located. So I walked over immediately, and I got a tour of Ampere, which is working on designing electric airplanes. Now, we covered that in the news back in episode 112 of the Aviation News Talk podcast. They're a California startup, and they've successfully flown their first hybrid aircraft. That plane is modeled on a Cessna 337 Skymaster, has a normal engine in the front. In addition, it's got an electric engine in the rear. And I'll try to get an interview with the company sometime down the road, as they're working on some interesting new things, though unfortunately I'm not at liberty to share what I was able to see when I was there. But it was great to meet Russell. And I was also in Rapid City for a few hours last week, and I gave a tour to a pilot over Mount Rushmore. Now, the pilot's name was Mike. I'm guessing he was in his 70s. He owns an older round gauge Mooney. He didn't have any prior experience with glass cockpits, so as you can well imagine, he was totally blown away by the capabilities of the Garmin G3000 in the Vision Jet, especially when I loaded the visual approach and coupled it to the autopilot, which then flew a continuous curve path to final while descending to arrive on the final at the appropriate height. So that was fun. I got some good pictures, which I posted on Instagram. And the night before, I was in Bozeman, Montana. It was cold that night, and we had arranged to be parking in a hangar at Rocky Mountain Rotors. And as we arrived, the hangar door was coming up, and it revealed not only a huge, large American flag, a King Air, but also the only civilian MiG-29 in existence. So it was quite the sight to taxi into that hangar, which I'd never done before. I've always had aircraft kind of towed into hangars, but we taxied into the hangar while staring at this MiG-29. Now, apparently it's owned by the estate of Paul Allen, who is an executive of Microsoft who has since passed away. But that was pretty spectacular, and again, I posted pictures of that MiG-29 on my Instagram account at Aviation News Talk. Now, on a different trip last week in Salt Lake City, going into the main airport at Salt Lake City, we botched an arrival. And of course, as soon as we did it, I realized our mistake. I'm always telling clients that whenever they load a departure procedure or an arrival procedure, they should pull out the chart and take a look at it. We did not do that. And of course, the arrival split into two pieces, one if the airport was landing to the north and one if it was landing to the south. Well, the runways had changed. At one point, ATC had told us that Salt Lake City was landing to the north. We did not take that hint to take a look at our arrival and reprogram it. So we ended up on the wrong leg. They were very nice about it and gave us vectors to the airport from there. By the way, after we departed Salt Lake City and flew on to San Francisco Bay Area, it was just a spectacular flight. We turned all the displays down so that it was dark inside. Looking outside, we could see the moon, we could see stars, and then all the lights on the ground, particularly as we came up over Reno, Nevada. It was just a sea of lights, really spectacular. I got to tell you, I think the only thing that would have completed that picture was to have a meteorite streak across the sky. And it kind of reminds me of the beauty of flying anytime, but especially at night. Now, on one of those trips at an airport that I will not name, the fuel guy did not put a fuel cap on for a Cessna 206 that was parked next to us. And the sheriff's deputy was complaining bitterly about that. Now, here's an interesting thing. The same thing had happened to us a few weeks ago at a different airport that, once again, I won't mention. And we called the line guy out after we saw our fuel cap just sitting on the wing and asked him if he noticed anything wrong with the airplane. And he didn't. And I had to point out to him that the fuel cap was still sitting on the wing. And, of course, they apologized profusely. And the supervisor said, oh, he's new, he's in training, blah, blah, blah. But I'm curious, has this ever happened to you? I mean, I thought it was odd to see this happen twice in a 2-week period, but it really does show the importance of always checking the fuel caps. Now, last week I talked about the overly complex ODPs coming out of San Gabriel Valley and Brackett Field in Southern California. Now, by contrast, we flew the new SpaceX departure procedure out of Hawthorne on the very first day that it was available on January 30th on a trip to Ogden, Utah. Now, this was probably one of the easiest, least complex flights I have ever had out of Southern California, which is amazing when you consider that Hawthorne is located, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 miles away from LAX. And essentially at 400 feet, you just make a left turn that turns you a little bit away from LAX, takes you out over the ocean, you make another left turn, and then you're pretty much on your way. So Kudos to the FAA for creating the SpaceX departure procedure out of Hawthorne. And of course, that's named for the company SpaceX, which has a lot of its facilities right there on the Hawthorne Airport property. And I'm back here at home in the home studio. Continuing on, I noticed in the last couple of years, whenever we change our destination, ATC, especially centers, will ask us why it is that we're changing our destination. So we did a couple of changes over the last couple of weeks, and we're asked that. So I queried one of my friends in ATC, and I asked him, what's going on here? Are they trying to discover whether perhaps the pilot's having an emergency that they're reluctant to declare, or is there something else going on? He said security. He said when certain aircraft, especially carriers or cargo, change their destination, the DEN, that's the Domestic Events Network, which we've talked about briefly before, is notified. They do a risk assessment and make sure nothing nefarious is going on. He said, I'll try to find the link, but the funniest IFR change of a destination radio call I ever heard was a booty call. So I'm guessing they figured that was not a terror threat. And we had an interesting little programming problem in the Vision Jet a couple of days ago while flying into Hawthorne in Southern California. Now, you can actually encounter the problem we had with most any GPS, which is why I wanted to mention it. We were coming from the Northwest, and we were told to fly to SMO, the Santa Monica VOR, which was not in our clearance or our flight plan, and then to depart the VOR on a heading, which I think was 107 degrees. So the pilot entered SMO into the flight plan, and we started flying direct to the VOR. But then a couple miles before the VOR, the autopilot started making a hard turn to the left away from the VOR. And the problem was that the pilot had inserted the waypoint into a random place in the flight plan, and the next waypoint in the flight plan was one that was behind us. So because of the turn anticipation feature of the GPS, anytime you have a really sharp turn to a waypoint behind you, turn anticipation will start giving you and the autopilot guidance to turn back miles before you get to the waypoint in front of you. And by starting the turn early, GPS is able to roll out onto the next leg, which is going to be very close to you when you have a sharp turn. So it has to start the turn miles before you reach the waypoint that's in front of you. Now, a simple solution would have been for the pilot to enter SMO as the last waypoint of the flight plan so that it wouldn't start turning to any other waypoints before we reached SMO. And that would have worked in the G1000, but in the G3000, you can't enter any waypoints after the destination, so that wouldn't have worked for us. But there are some other solutions I'll mention. By the way, when the autopilot started turning left, the pilot was slow to react, and ATC asked why we were turning away. Now, the classic thing we've taught pilots to do in this situation is to disconnect the autopilot and hand fly the airplane back where it needs to go. That way you minimize the deviation and you get the airplane back on course as quickly as possible. If you try instead to fix the programming, the airplane is just going to deviate farther and farther from course until you can fix it. Now, there is another solution if you're in an aircraft with the blue level button, and that's found on the Garmin G500 aftermarket autopilot, as well as many of the GFC 700 autopilots that are used in some versions of the G1000, Perspective, and G3000 glass cockpits. Pushing that button instantly stops any turns, so the aircraft won't deviate any further off course while you're fixing a programming problem. So keep that in mind. If you have a level button, you can push it to stop bad behavior by the autopilot, to stop whatever turn it may be in. Now, if we had realized this problem ahead of time, there are a variety of ways we could have planned to handle it. For example, before the aircraft started turning to the next waypoint, we could have put the GPS in OBS mode, which would have prevented it from sequencing to the next waypoint. Or we could have pushed the nav button on the autopilot, which would have put us in roll mode, which would keep the wings level and keep us on course for the last couple of minutes heading to the SMO VOR. Also, had we realized we were going to have a problem, we could have put the autopilot into the heading mode and used that to get to the SMO VOR. And finally, since the G3000 doesn't let us put a fix in after the destination airport, we could have deleted our destination so that SMO was the final waypoint in the flight plan, but I'd rather not do that. I always like having my destination in the flight plan. Now, I'm always telling pilots to avoid an automation surprise like this. You want to look at your flight plan periodically and verify the sequence of waypoints in the flight plan, because that kind of tells you what the next turn is going to be. Had we done that, we would have seen that we were about to get a rogue turn and could have dealt with it before the turn occurred. And there is nothing rogue about the many people who support this show. This is a listener-supported show. It takes me literally a couple days to put every show together, which takes me away from teaching, and I love all the support that I get from people, and there are so many different ways you can support the show. Some people do that by buying my books, like my Max Truscott's G1000 and Perspective Glass Cockpit Handbook, which you can order at 800-247-6553, and other people support the show with a donation through Patreon or PayPal. And why do I mention this? Well, because even though we get a few new Patreon supporters every month, we lose a few each month. People who either have credit cards that have been declined or have decided to stop supporting the show for whatever reason. So we're constantly looking for new members to help support the show. And let me tell you about some of the new people who have just decided to support the show. Vincent Salami, he is now a mega supporter. He's donating $51 a month through PayPal, which we greatly appreciate. I'll tell you a little bit more about him in a moment. Also, new mega supporter Stephen Smart, who's donating $50 a month through Patreon. We also have new Patreon members who are donating monthly, including David Eikenberry, Ralph P., who added his pledge up to $8, Chris Siggins, and Duncan Gillis. And I want to apologize to Jeffrey Tarnoff. I combined his name with somebody else's name last week and forgot to mention it. Now, Jeffrey Tarnoff is supporting us at the $35 a month level, which gives him complete free access to all the online courses, which I have out at pilotlearning.com. And we also have a new monthly PayPal supporter, which is Sebastian Shun, and he's been emailing me about stopping in the Bay Area and getting a ride in the Cirrus, so we'll certainly work on that with him. And I always mention every month the mega supporters, the people who donate $50 a month or more, and after 2 months of support, I send them one of my books, and those mega supporters are Brian Deere, who lives here in Northern California and flies a Turbo 206, Tyson Weiss, co-founder of ForeFlight, Victor Vogel, who lives in central Pennsylvania, flies a Cirrus, Tim Delaney here in Northern California, flying a Cirrus SR20. Stephen Elop, he flies a Turbo 182 and a Citation M2. He's the CEO of API Jet. Mike Williams, president of Keomac and TCB Composites, which make composite spinners and bulkheads for GA aircraft. Seth Lake, he's a DPE down in Arkansas, also specializes in teaching the multi-engine rating. So if you need to get your multi-engine rating, check out vsl.aero. Rick Miller, who instructs in the Cincinnati area at the Lincoln Flight Training Center and also flies with people who own their own Pipers, Cessnas, Beechcraft, and Cicadas. Justin Winter, he's been licensed for 3 years and flies a 2019 SR22T. Carl and Ann Rossi of Maine Cooncat Aviation. They are proud owners and operators of 3 Cessna T240 aircraft. Johnny McDade, who's a singer-songwriter, musician, and record producer. Jim Goldfuss has just returned from a long hiatus from flying, and he's working to get his CFI. He says he'd like to instruct full-time at the Republic Airport on Long Island. Charlie Mason flies out of Santa Monica after being out of flying for a long time, and he's getting checked out in a Cirrus SR20. Vincent Salami, he is a council member for the city of Pinole. He's also the owner of Salami Construction Management in San Francisco, California. And finally, Stephen Smart. He flies a Pilatus PC-12 for a Part 135 Air Ambulance Company in Arkansas, where he's also a company instructor and check airman, and he flies a Piper Meridian and Cessna 210. Now, it's so easy to support the show and Patreon. Just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome or aviationnewstalk.com/Patreon, Patreon. And you can enter a credit card and sign up for monthly donations. And of course, at the $4 a month level, you will get, every time we do a news show, a copy of our show plan. And for people who donate at the $8 a month level, not only will they see our full show notes, but they'll also get links to the many news stories that we had to cut because we didn't have enough time to fit them all into the show. So I want to thank everyone for supporting the show in whatever way you choose to do it. Now, in a moment, we're going to talk about Special VFR right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Now let's talk about Special VFR. But more importantly, let's talk about when you might want to use Special VFR, what kind of guidelines you might want to set for yourself when flying Special VFR, and talk about some of the risks associated with flying Special VFR. We will, of course, also talk about the regulations surrounding Special VFR, both for pilots and air traffic controllers, and I'm guessing there are probably 1 or 2 nuances about those rules with which you may be unfamiliar. And we'll also talk about some accidents involving Special VFR. But first, let's talk philosophically about FAA rules. I would say that in general, FAA rules tend to be permissive. That is, they generally allow you to do what you want to do when you fly unless it's patently unsafe or disruptive. And the rules take into consideration that under some circumstances, flying under less than perfect conditions can be entirely safe, while under other circumstances, the exact same type of flying could be dangerous. And rather than prohibit flight that is sometimes dangerous but at other times safe, the FAA often permits that type of behavior. And so they leave it up to pilots to decide and judge for themselves whether a permitted flight operation will indeed be safe or whether that permitted flight operation is unwise under the current circumstances. And in the latter case, the FAA is relying on pilots to recognize the difference, exercise their good judgment, and choose not to fly when a permitted operation seems risky or unsafe. Special VFR falls squarely into this category of permissive rulemaking. At times, it's perfectly safe, yet at other times, Special VFR is not a safe option and pilots should not pursue it. Now, the problem is that Special VFR is rarely used, and I'm guessing that you've probably never used it yourself, or if you have, you've only used it a handful of times in your flying career. And since Special VFR rarely gets used, pilots don't have much experience with it and may not know when to use it and when not to use it, which is why they sometimes get into accidents when they choose to use Special VFR. Back in 2001, Howard Freed wrote on avweb.com that Special VFR is something that most pilots can't grasp and rarely use. He says, as an instructor, I always caution my students regarding the use of SVFR privilege. I always tell them about the brand new private pilot who took a friend and started to go for lunch. That was his first passenger for the $100 hamburger. From Potomac, Michigan to Lansing, Michigan, a distance of about 65 miles. Both the departure and destination airports were reporting ceilings of 800 to 900 feet and visibility of 2 to 3 miles with no weather reporting stations in between. By the way, this is really a key point that I'd like to make. Once you leave an airport, you often have no weather reporting for what the weather is like immediately beyond your departure airport. Now, Howard continues, he says, the terrain between the two is fairly flat and there are no obstacles except for a couple of towers southeast of the Lansing airport. But the brand new private pilot didn't seem to realize that the weather along the way could be worse. When they found the wreckage with 2 bodies, it was in an orchard about 35 miles along the way on a straight line course from Potomac to Lansing. It's episodes like this that give Special VFR a bad name, and there are a lot of such episodes. All right, good article. Now, we'll go back in a few minutes and talk about other accidents involving Special VFR, but first, let's step back and go over the rules for Special VFR. This comes from the FAA's Aeronautical Information Manual, better known as the AIM. Section 4-4-6 is called Special VFR Clearances. Section A starts, an ATC clearance must be obtained prior to operating within a Class B, Class C, Class D, or Class E surface area when the weather is less than that required for a VFR flight. So this may be your first surprise. You probably know that Class B surrounds the 37 biggest airports in the U.S., and the smaller Class C airspace is found around the next largest 122 airports in the U.S., and there are about 475 Class D airports in the U.S. But what the heck is a Class E surface area? If you go to a sectional map and look for KMCE, the Merced Regional Airport in Central California, you'll find a good example. The red dashed line around it indicates a Class E surface area. This is a non-towered airport, but it does have an ILS with minimums of just 200 feet above the ground. If this airport had Class G airspace above it, as most non-towered airports do, VFR pilots could fly over the airport in the daytime in 1 mile visibility as long as they stayed clear of clouds and below either 1,200 feet or 700 feet AGL. And that could create a very dangerous conflict between those VFR aircraft and IFR aircraft flying the ILS to Merced. But by giving Merced a Class C surface area, it forces VFR pilots to adhere to higher minimums. Specifically, a VFR pilot flying in a Class C surface area would need basic VFR, meaning they would have to have at least 3 mile visibility and a ceiling of at least 1,000 feet. Plus, that pilot would have to stay at least 500 feet below the base of the clouds, which would go a long way toward protecting any IFR pilots flying the ILS into Merced. So here's an interesting question for you to think about. If there's no tower at Merced, how does a pilot get a Special VFR clearance, which he or she would need before entering the Class E airspace when the airport is below basic VFR minimums? We'll get back to that in a minute, but let's continue with the rules. A VFR pilot may request and be given a clearance to enter, leave, or operate within most Class D and Class E surface areas and some Class B and Class C surface areas in special VFR conditions, traffic permitting, providing such flight will not delay IFR operations. All special VFR flights must remain clear of clouds. The visibility requirements for special VFR aircraft other than helicopters are 1. At least 1 statute mile flight visibility for operations within Class B, C, D, and Class E surface areas. 2. At least 1 statute mile ground visibility if taking off or landing. If ground visibility is not reported at that airport, the flight visibility must be at least 1 statute miles. 3. The restrictions in subparagraphs 1 and 2 do not apply to helicopters. Helicopters must remain clear of clouds and may operate in Class B, C, D, and E surface areas with less than 1 mile visibility. When a control tower is located within the Class B, C, or D surface area, requests for clearances should be to the tower. In a Class E surface area, a clearance may be obtained from the nearest tower, flight service station, or center. So there's the answer to that question. If you want a special VFR clearance into Merced, contact the nearest tower, FSS, or center. Though in reality at that airport, you'd want to call NorCal Approach since they are responsible for all IFR clearances in the Merced, and hence are the only ones that will know whether your special VFR flight would conflict with an incoming IFR aircraft. Continuing with the rules, C, it is not necessary to file a complete flight plan with a request for clearance, but pilots should state their intentions in sufficient detail to permit ATC to fit their flight into the traffic flow. The clearance will not contain a specific altitude as the pilots must remain clear of clouds. The controller may require the pilot to fly at or below a certain altitude due to other traffic, but the altitude specified will permit flight at or above the minimum safe altitude. In addition, at radar locations, flights may be vectored if necessary for control purposes or on pilot request. And then the rules contain this note. Note, the pilot is responsible for obstacle or terrain clearance. Now, why is ATC not responsible for obstacle or terrain clearance? Because rules state, quote, the clearance will not contain the specific altitude as the pilot must remain clear of clouds. So this is a very important point. Pilots, when you accept a special VFR clearance, you are on your own. You are totally responsible for making sure that you avoid hitting anything, and this is one of the dangers of special VFR. You are flying around in low visibility and can't see well, but you're still completely responsible for not hitting anything, even those things that you may just barely be able to see out the window. Continuing on in the AIM, D, special VFR clearances are effective within Class B, C, D, and E surface areas only. ATC does not provide separation after an aircraft leaves the Class B, C, D, or E surface area on a special VFR clearance. E, special VFR operations by fixed-wing aircraft are prohibited in some Class B and Class C surface areas due to the volume of IFR traffic. A list of these surface areas is contained in Part 91, Appendix D, Section 3. They're also depicted on sectional aeronautical charts. And by the way, if you were to look at a VFR sectional chart and find a Class B airport near you, most of the time you're going to see no SVFR, which means no special VFR, printed in the data block that lists the information on the chart for that airport. Continuing on from the AIM, F, ATC provides separation between special VFR flights and between these flights and other IFR flights. G, special VFR operations by fixed-wing aircraft are prohibited between sunset and sunrise unless the pilot is instrument rated and the aircraft is equipped for IFR flight. H, pilots arriving or departing an uncontrolled airport that has an automated weather broadcast capability, such as an ASOS or AWOS, should monitor the broadcast frequency, advise the controller that they have the 1-minute weather, and state intentions prior to operating within Class B, C, D, or Class E surface area. So that's what the AIM has to say about special VFR. Now let's talk about some accidents involving special VFR. The Kobe Bryant helicopter crash in Southern California last week has been plastered across the news, and much has been made that the pilot had special VFR clearances from both the Burbank Tower and later from the Van Nuys Tower. However, the pilot was outside the Class Delta of both those airports and was no longer on a special VFR clearance when he crashed. After exiting the Van Nuys Class D, he asked SoCal Approach to provide flight following, but was told the helicopter was too low to be seen on radar. About 4 minutes later, the pilot advised that they were climbing to avoid a cloud layer, and that was his last transmission. There are indications that the helicopter plunged some 1,000 feet. It was flying at about 184 miles per hour and descending at a rate of more than 4,000 feet per minute when it struck the ground, according to data from Flight Radar 24. The helicopter was a 1991 Sikorsky S-76. It didn't have a TAWS or terrain awareness system on board, nor was it required to have one. Of course, most electronic flight bag apps such as ForeFlight and Garmin Pilot contain a terrain awareness database, and an iPad containing ForeFlight was found in the wreckage. ForeFlight's Hazard Advisor, which colors terrain to show whether it's above or below your present altitude, is included with ForeFlight's Pro-level subscription. So if you have the $99 a year basic level subscription, you might want to consider upgrading to the $199 a year Pro level to get the Hazard Advisor. Now, many people have asked why Kobe Bryant's helicopter wasn't flying IFR on a day when weather conditions were such that the LA Police Department and the County Sheriff's Department had grounded their helicopters, and their minimums are reported to be clouds of 800 feet and visibility of 2 miles. Now, the answer to that question is that the helicopter was being chartered from Island Express Helicopters and is very common in the LA area. The company's charter certificate was only valid for VFR conditions. So legally, they couldn't conduct a charter flight like the one with Kobe Bryant on board under IFR conditions. Hence, their only choices were to fly the flight lower under the clouds in VFR or special VFR conditions, or to not fly at all. And in retrospect, perhaps they shouldn't have been flying. But this was a flight carrying a celebrity. I think that sometimes pilots take risks they normally wouldn't take because they're trying to please a celebrity or a boss, but that pressure is often self-induced. If instead of feeling pressure to complete a flight that we know is risky, if pilots would instead have an honest conversation with their passengers about the safety of the flight, most passengers, even celebrities and bosses, would say it's okay to cancel the flight. And an article I saw in the Washington Post speaks exactly to this point. It says, did the pilot make a critical mistake? Zobayan, the name of the pilot, could have landed at Burbank's airport, but that would have forced passengers to seek ground transportation the rest of the way. That's never an easy judgment call to make, especially when you're carrying a VIP. Psychologically, that's the hardest part, Kurt Dietz, a former Island Express pilot, told The Times. Biting the bullet and saying, the weather's crap, I have to turn back, it's hard to accept the fact that you can't get the job done. Instead, pilots often continue on, and even the most experienced can become disoriented if not relying on instruments when cloud cover thickens and obscures the horizon. So my advice to you as a pilot is that if you think through these kinds of scenarios ahead of time and decide ahead of time what you will do if you find yourself in a situation of lowering clouds or decreasing visibility, especially if you have someone on board you're trying to please. Now, my suggestion is you tell those passengers before you launch that the weather is poor and that if it gets worse, you'll need to turn around and come back or land at a different airport, and that you'll be doing that for their safety. And if you verbalize a plan like this ahead of time, I think you're much more likely to actually act on the plan when you encounter worsening weather. Now let's look briefly at the 7110.65, that's the controller handbook, and touch on some of the things it says about special VFR. It says that 1, when weather conditions are not reported at the airport of intended landing departure and the pilot advises that VFR cannot be maintained and requests special VFR, here's the phraseology that controllers are to use, and I'll insert my home airport name of Palo Alto so that you can hear what a clearance sounds like. Cleared to enter the surface area of the Palo Alto airport and maintain special VFR conditions, and if required, at or below a certain altitude, or cleared for an arrival or departure. And then under the heading priority, the controller handbook says, SVFR flights may be approved only if arriving and departing IFR aircraft are not delayed. And it says to 1, inform an aircraft of the anticipated delay when an SVFR clearance cannot be granted because of IFR traffic. And here's a special section that applies to visibilities less than 1 mile. It says 1, ground visibility below 1 mile. Part 91 does not prohibit helicopter SVFR flight when the visibility is less than 1 mile. Treat requests for SVFR fixed-wing operations as follows when the ground visibility is officially reported at an airport as less than 1 mile. Inform departing aircraft that ground visibility is less than 1 mile and that a clearance cannot be issued. 2, inform arriving aircraft operating outside of a Class B, C, D, or Class E surface area that ground visibility is less than 1 mile and that, unless an emergency exists, a clearance cannot be issued. And 3, inform arriving aircraft operating VFR, SVFR within a Class B, C, D, or Class E surface area that ground visibility is less than 1 mile and request that the pilot advise intentions. And it says that Section 91.157 prohibits VFR aircraft other than helicopters from landing at any airport within a surface area when ground visibility is less than 1 mile. And you probably know that if an airport is IFR, a controller is not permitted to offer special VFR to you. You have to know what special VFR is, and you have to request it. And this sometimes leads to some interesting conversations. I remember listening to the radio at my home airport at Palo Alto one night when the visibility was 2.5 miles, which was just below VFR minimums. And I heard a pilot call in and he said something like, Palo Alto Tower, Cessna 345 at Leslie Salt, landing with information X-ray. The tower replied, Cessna 345, the field is IFR, say intentions. The pilot, who was obviously a little confused, said, well, I'm at Leslie Salt with X-ray and I'd like to land. And then the tower replied, "The field is IFR. Would you like something special?" At which point the light bulb went off in the pilot's head and he said something like, oh, yes, I'd like Special VFR. So sometimes ATC will help jog your memory, but they are not permitted to say, would you like Special VFR? Now let's talk about when you might reasonably decide to use Special VFR and when you should probably stay away from it. If you're requesting Special VFR to depart an airport, then I suggest you do it only if you have a very high level of confidence that you're headed toward improving weather and that it will improve quickly soon after you depart the airport. Here's a good example. At my home airport of Palo Alto, we occasionally get an inversion layer during the winter months that traps a layer of haze close to the ground. This occurs most often in the morning or late afternoon as temperatures cool and reduces visibilities to perhaps 2 miles. However, the inversion layer is rarely more than 1,500 feet thick. So if you're climbing after takeoff at 750 feet per minute, 2 minutes after takeoff, you reach the top of the inversion layer and your visibility jumps from 2 miles to more than 30 miles. So this is a case where Special VFR has relatively little risk, provided that you can safely control the plane for 2 minutes in 2-mile visibility. But what if you have a solid cloud ceiling above you at 900 feet? At the airport, you have weather reporting capability, but after you leave the airport, you may have no idea what the weather is like 5, 10, or 50 miles from the airport. In that case, you won't have a high level of confidence that you are headed toward improving weather, and you probably shouldn't depart Special VFR. Now, in the case of the Kobe Bryant crash, it was 40 miles from the departure airport to the Burbank airport where they first got Special VFR, and it was another 18 miles from the Burbank airport to the crash site. So that's a long ways to travel in marginal VFR and Special VFR conditions. In general, the longer the distance you travel, the more likely the weather is to change. And of course, there's a 50-50 chance that the weather will get worse after you depart from an airport. So you want to carefully research the weather, and if you don't have weather information outside the terminal area, don't just assume that it's going to get better. So another guideline for flying Special VFR is to only do it when your flight is short, so as to minimize the chance that the weather will get worse as you leave an airport. Now here's an example of an excellent time to consider using Special VFR. Imagine you departed in good weather, but the weather suddenly gets worse. In that case, you might want to use Special VFR to land at the nearest airport so that you can get on the ground quickly before the weather deteriorates even more. Now, I've talked in the past about another use of Special VFR at my home airport, and oddly, because of a recent change, pilots may have to start using it again. Years ago, there was no instrument approach into the Palo Alto airport, but we could sometimes get into the airport by flying an instrument approach into the nearby Hayward airport on the other side of the South Bay. After landing at Hayward, they would issue Special VFR clearance. We would then take off, and a couple miles later, we'd be over the bay, where the only obstacles between Hayward and Palo Alto are the KGO radio towers and the 2 towers on the Dumbarton Bridge. And if we stayed below 700 feet, we'd be in Class G, which permitted us to fly in as little as 1 mile visibility in the daytime. After crossing the bay, we could then request Special VFR to land at Palo Alto. Now, recently, the IFR approaches at Palo Alto have been noted as being not available at night for reasons that nobody I've talked to at the airport seems to know. So now if Palo Alto is IFR at night, pilots may once again be forced to fly an instrument approach at Hayward and then fly Special VFR to Palo Alto. Though when they're in Class G over the bay, they'd now need to have 3-mile visibility since this would be at night. As I mentioned, there's a lot of judgment that goes into flying Special VFR, and I want to mention how difficult it can be to navigate in poor visibility. In my area, we have many mountains, and the pilots use these mountains a lot to determine their position and to visually navigate throughout the area. However, if you have 1 to 3 mile visibility, which is what you'd have when you're flying Special VFR, you can't see the mountains. In fact, most of what you see is straight down below you. And when you fly for the first time in low visibility over a metropolitan area, you'd be amazed to see how much everything looks the same and how difficult it is to determine visually where you are. Many of the houses and buildings look pretty much the same when you're looking straight down, so it can be hard to figure out where you are unless you're using GPS and have a moving map of some kind. Probably one of the best ways to navigate in these situations is to follow roads with which you're very familiar, though it's important that you know whether there are wires that cross these roads, and if there are, you need to make sure that you stay above them. Likewise, if there are tall radio towers in your area, you also need to be very familiar with their location and avoid them. And this brings me to another one of my guidelines for flying Special VFR. Only get a Special VFR clearance if you are flying in and out of an area that you know like the back of your hand. And in most cases, that means only get Special VFR in and out of your home airport. and only depart if you know that you're going to be going toward rapidly improving weather. And those are my thoughts on Special VFR. If you have any other thoughts on Special VFR that you'd like to share, please send me an email at aviationnewstalk@gmail.com. And coming up next, listener feedback right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And here's a message I got via Facebook Messenger from Patrick. He says, thanks for your work on the podcast you are a part of. He says, I'm just under 500-hour police helicopter pilot with, he mentions the unit. He says, we fly MD-520s. Your podcasts are very helpful and entertaining. And he mentions that they are at Burbank the other day, and he admired a Vision Jet there, November 155, Victor Juliet, as we hover taxied by. And I told him, coincidentally, I was going to be down there in 2 days to fly that exact airplane. And I told him not only do they look nice, the avionics and cockpit design is very comfortable and pleasing. And he asked if we'd be interested in showing it off to a couple of police helicopter pilots who would love to see it. And we tried to do that, but schedules just didn't match up. So anyway, Patrick, thanks so much for your message. Hopefully we'll get to show you one of these airplanes sometime in the future. And here's an email from Mike, a friend of mine who's an airline pilot, also a speaker at some of the AOPA regional fly-ins. He says, I just listened to yet another great edition of your podcast, and portions of episode 136 struck me close to my heart, particularly the portion about flying in and out of the SoCal area. I had to laugh when you mentioned the departure procedure out of KPOC. The first time I did that one when I got back into GA was with a client in his Garmin 530 equipped airplane. I'd never seen a GPS navigator in GA, and when we got that clearance, he gave me a blank look and asked how he would enter that. I had no idea, so we did it with terrestrial nav aids and broke out the books at our lunch stop and figured it out. He said, I could not agree that this is an area that is ripe for improvement. And of course, I had said in my episode that if the FAA was listening, boy, we really need to clean up the ODPs coming out of Brackett Field and also San Gabriel Valley. He says, I am a member of the Southern California Airspace Users Working Group, and those initials form their website, so SCAUWG.org. He says it's a great resource for information about flying in SoCal in general, and we're considering establishing a subcommittee to try to clean up these routes and make them more useful, both for pilots and for ATC. If you or any of your listeners have any input or suggestions on any of these routes, please send them to me. I'll try to make sure that info gets to where it's needed. Thanks again for another great podcast and for all you do. And if you'd like to send your suggestions to Mike for improving IFR routings in Southern California, he gave us this email address, which is mcjesch@gmail.com. And finally, if you're one of those folks who's been thinking, yeah, I'd like to support this show, well, we're at the end. You can pull over, stop what you're doing, and go out to aviationnewstalk.com/Patreon or aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal and go ahead and send us a contribution. And finally, please take a moment to show your aviation friends how they can listen to the Aviation News Talk podcast. And of course, the statistics say that half the people in the U.S. still don't know what a podcast is. So if your friends are in that category, send them out to the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store, and they can download our dedicated Aviation News Talk podcast app for iOS and Android. So in the App Store, just search for Aviation News Talk, and of course, those apps are free. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.